History Readathon going on right now, which I am super excited about because I have been searching for inspiration to finish reading some of the history books on my TBR. I'm talking in particular about William Dalrymple's The Anarchy, which I bought right before the pandemic, and then my brain short-circuited and I haven't been able to read anything other than romance and fantasy for the past few months. But as you will know if you've been around my channel for a while, I do read a lot of history and I read a lot of historical fiction. I think if you go to my history playlist, you'll see more historical fiction, and I think I've spoken briefly about a couple of nonfiction books that I was trying to get through during the pandemic, but I haven't done any in-depth book reviews of nonfiction reads, and I was trying to think why that was, and I realized it's because I've only been here for 3 months. Patience. But as I was saying, I was looking at Rosie's video and she has an excellent TBR list, and I thought this might be a good way for me to finish The Anarchy myself. And I'm going to link down below to the creators of the challenge who also created this tag. And because I only have like one book in my TBR list, I thought I'd do the tag because it's really interesting. Okay, the first question is, what first got you into history? I have no idea. I think it's a combination of just growing up in Delhi, which is a city that lives with its past in the most relaxed fashion you've ever seen. Like growing up, everybody had a ruin in their backyard and it was always like 800, 900, 5,000 years old. The zoo is in an ancient fort that is still being excavated. So it's kind of impossible not to think about history, even in the most tangential, superficial way if you're living in a place like Delhi. But also, I grew up in a home with a father who was very interested in history. Although I think his real interest lies in historical figures. So at the dinner table, he would just say all these stories about people that I'd never heard of before because I was like 4 years old. And as I grew older, I would just read these books that he had lying around the house, and it was always really interesting. And then I discovered historical fiction and I never looked back. What is your favorite history book / author? If you've been here before, then you know my opinion about finding a favorite anything. Like, I just can't do it. I always have multiples. That said, gun to my head, I would say that The City of Jinns is probably my favorite novel, or it's the novel that I like to recommend a great deal because it is really a love letter to a city that I adore. And it's a personal narrative, but it's also a history of all the strange bits of Delhi that make it so complex and interesting. It is, however, written by William Dalrymple, who is an author that I read all the time, but I also think is problematic. But that's a whole other conversation that I'll probably have in another video, probably about The Anarchy. What is your most anticipated history book? Gosh, there's like a bunch of them. So I love to read a lot of film history, and my friend Uday, who is an excellent film critic, has been working on a history of this movie called Satya that came out in the 1990s, and it's a gangster film that's set in the Mumbai underworld, and it absolutely changed and transformed Indian cinema when it came out. It's possibly the best collection of not just performers but also below the line crew, and I'm really looking forward to it because it's also a really eccentric bunch of people, and I'm sure there was like tons of drama, but also these were all people who were working on the top of their game, and it's a film with a great deal of meaning for a lot of us cinephiles in India, and I'm really looking forward to that, but he's still working on it. My other friend Shai Hussain, who did the intro music for our Bollywood podcast, is also working on a novel that's set during the British Empire, and I think it's set during what Indians like to call the First War of Independence. I spoke about it briefly in my MMK video, but is also known as the Mutiny of 1857 to most British people. And I'm really looking forward to his novel because it's apparently going to be really actiony and tons of fun. Then later this year, there is going to be a book coming out about the making of Goodfellas, which is again a movie that I enjoyed a lot. There's a book called Digital Cash that I'm really looking forward to, but that's really wild to me because it's about cryptocurrency, and it is wild to me that something that was developed in my lifetime, like not even like my lifetime, but in my adult lifetime, is already considered history. But that's what tech is like. Things just move so fast. There's also another book called Putting the Tea in Britain that I'm looking forward to, and that is actually a book about how the British stole tea from China and then grew it in India, and then it became like a staple of the British diet and British culture, I think. So I know the bare bones of the story already. I mean, if you are interested in history and you're in India and you like tea, then this is a story that pretty much everyone knows already. But I don't think I've read a proper deep dive book about the subject, and I'm really looking forward to it, and I want to see how it fits into the current climate. I mean, this book could be dated the minute it's published. I mean, it could be dated already depending upon the kind of angle they take and the kind of research they've done, but I'm really hoping for good things for this book. What is your favorite time period, and what book do you want to read about it? Again, I don't think I have a favorite time period because I can't make choices apparently. But I feel like I've read way too much about Europe already, so I am trying to diversify a lot more, and I'm trying to read more about other cultures in Asia and Africa and Latin America, which is basically a huge blind spot for me. I think I've read more colonizer trash about South America than I have about any other continent, including Africa, and that's a real achievement. So I'm taking suggestions. If you have books that you'd like to recommend about Latin America, then I would really appreciate it. But in terms of books that I wish people would write, I was just thinking the other day that there aren't enough books about women. I was thinking about this particularly because I was looking into the life of Gyanathanandini Devi, who is the woman who is credited with inventing the Navi drape of the sari, which is the standard drape of a sari in India today. And when she invented it in the 19th century, it basically allowed women to participate in public spaces because she put it together in a way that allowed women to cover their entire body. It's a long, complicated story, and I'd be happy to talk about it on another video, but it just got me thinking about the number of women who have done very small, practical things to improve the lives of their sisters and how they never get the credit. I mean, there are probably 5 million books already about JFK, but where are the books about like women who made a better bra? Do you know how important a bra is to a woman? And I want to see more literature about them. I've also been lately a great deal into South Indian history. I just read this book called The Ivory Throne by Manu Pillai, and it's about the last days of the Travancore kingdom and about the two extraordinary women who fought with each other but also steered the kingdom through some of the most transformational and difficult days. It's a really interesting read, especially about the influence of colonialism and about a very unique culture that I'm ashamed to say I didn't know much about because my family is actually from Travancore, so I felt like I should know a lot more about this, and I would if there were more books about it. Who is your favorite person from history? What book do you want to read or have you read about it? I think Favorite is hard, not just because I can't choose, but because a lot of the people who have traditionally made history have made it because they're terrible people. So for instance, I am extremely interested in Genghis Khan, but the guy was a mass murderer. I mean, he killed millions of people and all he had were blades and horses. Can you imagine what the Horde would have done if they had bazookas? Similarly, I'm really interested in Catherine the Great of Russia, but again, she wasn't exactly the most sympathetic character. I'll put in a few links, however, of books that you should be reading about both these people. Oh, and Alexander. Everybody loves Alexander, don't they? Another thing that I really like to read about is the First World War, which is honestly the great event of the 20th century, I would say. I think it absolutely changed the course of all our history. They called it the war to end all wars, but what it actually was the war that would start a permanent war. And there was a book that came out a few years ago. It's called The Three Emperors. And I haven't read it yet, but it's been on my TBR list for the longest time. And until I read the description of the book, I'd forgotten that the three emperors that were involved in the First World War, the Russian Emperor, the German Kaiser, and the British Emperor, they were all first cousins thanks to Queen Victoria's matchmaking. And now, of course, I know that it's called the Cousins' War sometimes, but at that time I didn't know. And I remember my mind was just blown by that piece of information. So that's on my TBR list. What history topic would you like to see more fiction or non-fiction about? Okay, so my answer for this question is a little bit different in that I would actually like to see more innovative fiction in these fields. So for example, a friend of mine, Madhulika Little, writes these murder mysteries that are set in the Mughal Empire. And I think that's fascinating, you know, like I'd like to see more murder mysteries set in other parts of the world and in time periods that don't get a lot of attention and in parts of the world that don't get much attention. Historical murder mysteries do really well in England, for example, by which I mean like they're English set. But for some reason, they don't seem to have really penetrated other markets or spread to like other parts of the world. I know Abir Mukherjee writes about it in colonial Calcutta, and I think there might be an emerging trend in India and in Indian fiction. But I'd like to see it in other parts of the world as well, and I'd like to see more of it. There are so many historical settings that you could put these in. I also really enjoyed Naomi Novik's Temeraire, which she set during the Napoleonic Wars, but with dragons. And I think that's really cool, you know, like alt history fantasy novels. I know a lot of steampunk authors try to do that, and I'd like to see that in other places as well. Other places than England, I mean. I think these are all very doable concepts, and it just frustrates me when I don't see more of it. If you guys have recommendations, then I would really love to see more of those. What non-book resources do you enjoy when learning about history? Oh, I have tons actually. I listen to a bunch of podcasts on and off. So there's one about film history and it's called You Must Remember This, and I really enjoy that. Dan Carlin has a series called Hardcore History, and I first started listening to it because he had a series about the Mongols, and it's called The Wrath of Khan. Very clever. There's one called Lore that's very interesting, but I've only listened to a couple of episodes where, you know how there are all these scary stories and then people will be like, oh, we're going to tell you the real truth behind the legend, and actually it's all a bunch of nonsense and there isn't anything scary. Well, Lore does the exact opposite. Like they go and deep dive into folklore and then they'll tell you the real story, which is way creepier and scarier than the lore itself. So the concept cracks me up, but the podcast itself is kind of creepy. So if you're looking for a good fright, then that's a good podcast. There's also a Canadian writer whose last name I'm going to mangle in a second, and she writes about the queens of history. And I love that series because she's basically writing about them in a very gossipy, accessible kind of way, and it always makes me laugh when I read it. Her name is Anne Thriault, and I am going to link down to some of the pieces that she has published. I also watch any number of documentaries, so if something is on Netflix or Prime or wherever, then I am there. I don't really watch TV any longer, so I don't know how standards continue, but I remember back in the day, there used to be like really good documentaries. Comedy Central just cancelled Drunk History, which was one of my favorite programs, and I am really sad about that. I also really like historical dramas, and I've really gotten into Turkish historical dramas and obviously K-dramas and Japanese historicals and Chinese historicals. And are they straight history? I don't think so. I'm sure they're heavily edited and presented in a way that makes for better drama viewing, but my philosophy when it comes to history is that there's no reason why it shouldn't be entertaining. Most times when I'm watching something and I've enjoyed it, I'll always end up going and doing my own research about it, even if it's just on the internet. And I am perfectly capable as a grown woman of finding out the truth of matters. But as far as dramas are concerned, I just want to have a good time. What's a fun history fact/quote you can share with us? Okay, I don't have any quotes for you, but I do have a couple of fun facts that are related to other things that I've mentioned in this video. So I mentioned that I grew up in Delhi and that we all had ruins wherever we grew up in our backyards. And in my backyard, we had the remains of what is known as the Siri Fort. Now, Siri in the local language means head. And the reason why it's called the Head Fort is because back in the day, it used to be a fort of strategic importance. I forget which particular dynasty it was that built it, but I'll put it up here if I can find out. And the defenders of the fort, when they were attacked, and if they defeated the attacking forces, would cut off their heads and then place their heads on spikes all across the battlements so that people, when they were coming from miles across, could see the rotting, decomposing skulls that were displayed on top of the fort, but also the carrion eaters circling around the fort to peck out, choice bits of flesh from the skulls. It's stories like these that make me unable to understand people when they're like, oh, history's so boring. No, it isn't. You just had really terrible teachers who convinced you that history was boring. Actual history is wild. My other fun fact is about Nora Ephron, and again, like I said, I really enjoy film history. So Nora Ephron was married to Nicholas Pileggi, who was also a journalist and a writer, and he wrote this book called Wise Guys that was eventually made into Goodfellas, which he also co-wrote. So at the time when he was doing his research for Wise Guys, she would sometimes tag along and she would also talk to the same people. And the same year that Goodfellas came out, Nora Ephron wrote this movie called My Blue Heaven, which is excellent. And it's really sort of a companion piece to Goodfellas, which I didn't really know until fairly recently when somebody pointed it out, and it blows my mind. And as somebody on Twitter said, this is probably the best example of how it doesn't matter if two people have access to the same source material. What really matters is what they do with it. Also, I just miss Nora Ephron. Shout out a booktuber you enjoy who also reads history books. So it wasn't until I read this question that I realized that I don't really follow a lot of people who solely do history. So most people I know, they do like a mix of things, same as myself. And there's obviously Rosie, who I've talked about before and through whom I discovered this challenge. And I think Lana does a lot of history as well, or she's interested. And I know that Literarily Smitten is another person that I've discovered through Rosie's channel, and she does a lot of historical fiction. I think a lot of people that I follow are really interested in history but don't necessarily talk about it as much. But if I've missed you, please let me know, and I would love to put your name under this video. So that's my tag, and I hope to update you all very soon with my review for The Anarchy. For more videos, please hit the subscribe button.